In Dave Brunn's One Bible Many Versions, chapters 5 and 6, he discusses ways in which a translator might be forced to, quote, adjust their translation in order to create a clear and accurate translation. He suggests that there are four areas or four reasons that might lead to an adjustment of a translation, including the grammar of the target language, to make sure that the correct meaning is coming through, the clarity of expression, and the naturalness of the expression. He says to make the translation sound more like the way that we speak English. Now, he provides this chart, which is meant to be a sort of flow chart between these areas, and the meaning of this chart has to do with hierarchy, so that grammar is the most important. So if the grammar requires it, then yes, you have to do it. But even if the grammar is okay, you might be required because of the meaning, or if that's all right, maybe the clarity, and if that's okay, if all that's correct, you might still make an adjustment on the basis of naturalness, and that's an area that's probably the most controversial among different translation committees and adherents. So in his discussion of how we add things or take away things, or how we make adjustments based on what is required, the example he gives is from Matthew 1:6, where some versions, not the one I have, interestingly, but some versions of the New American Standard Bible add Bathsheba's name into Matthew 1:6. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother Bathsheba had been Uriah's wife. Now, Bathsheba, you'll see over here, her name does not appear in the Greek text, but he argues that it's perfectly fine to add Bathsheba because her name is implied by the text. And it's normal in genealogies to list the actual names, and so we should add the name. I actually disagree with that. I think that this case is a special case, and to delete her name here is a kind of protection of David, I think. To say that, even in the translation here, to say that Solomon's mother had been Uriah's wife is to protect David from certain kinds of criticism. Right? It makes Bathsheba sound like she was a widow who David married. I guess technically she was, even though she was a widow because David murdered her husband. So that's the example he gives. I think it's kind of an unfortunate one. But he argues ultimately that we cannot base every translation decision on the ideal of trying to match original words, because the ideal is not the world we work in. Now, in chapter 6, he discusses 6 particular questions that we might ask of translation, and I want to spend some time on each of these, especially the first 3. The question of translating word for word, of omitting words, of adding words, and I want to call into question the whole philosophical notion of omitting and adding in this context. Do they make single Hebrew terms turn into phrases in English? Are there certain ideas that change in conceptual ways? And are there terms that need to be changed because of present-day equivalences? Now, the fact is that word for word is, as we have seen in our class over and over, not a coherent idea, that it's impossible to translate word for word. Brunn, for example, gives this chart in which he points out that there are many different translations of single Hebrew terms. For example, this is the verb asa, to do or to make, that's translated in lots of different ways in the KJV and in other translations. And he has several of these. They're really interesting charts. And also that there are terms in the English Bible that actually reflect a variety of different Hebrew terms. So you can have, if you have the word dark in your English Bible, it could be 11 different Hebrew terms. Desolation, 12. Destruction, maybe not surprising, 35. Does it surprise you to know that there are at least 35 different Hebrew words for destruction? Not me. But in newer dictionaries, the one that I always use that is my favorite is the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew. You'll see that there is extensive discussion of lexical range and the shades of different meanings of the verb. So you can have to do something, but it's not just to do, but the concept of doing is divided up into a dozen different types of doing. And the concept of making is divided up into lots of different ways of making or ideas of making. to arrive at, right? To make can also mean to arrive at an idea or to make a proclamation, to appoint a boundary, to acquire something, to achieve, right? To put something to work, to violate. So this is a newer way of thinking about arrangement in a lexicon, which I think shows that Brunn's argument is correct, that as translators are encountering these verbs, they realize that actually there's no simple one-to-one correspondence. And in fact, you can't even just look at the word. You have to look at the whole context of the word, the phrase, the sentence, the whole passage, to decide which of these particular areas, which of these particular nuances of meaning is that particular use of the word shading toward. Now, in the notion of omitting words, he also talks about the example he gives is the word nephesh, which means soul to some degree in Hebrew, and that sometimes translations omit, he says, omit the word soul. So here the ESV in Psalm 16:10 says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol." And over here you can see here's nephesh in the Hebrew text. Whereas the NRSV says, "You do not give me up to Sheol." And the fact is that the word soul here is a synecdoche, which is a word in which a part of something stands in for the whole thing. So in the Psalms especially, and actually a lot of places in the Bible, my soul means me, or your soul means you. And so here, my soul means me. And so you're not omitting the word soul, you're just translating it me in this case. The whole notion of omitting and adding words doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a linguistic point of view. It implies that there's something real, something foundational, something that's, quote, there, that is being adapted or changed in some way, altered. And what Brunn is trying to do here is a kind of middle ground in which there is something old that is being augmented or changed or adapted as it is presented in a new way, so that there's parts of the old that are being bolted onto with new things, or I guess. I don't know what the metaphor is. It's a kind of middle ground. I'm not sure it's philosophically coherent. In his discussion of concepts, the only example that he gives is kind of unfortunate, where he talks about the use of the word bless in Job, which occurs, 5 times in Job, where the verb to bless God, here it is here in the Hebrew, is translated curse God in the English Bible. And Brunn suggests that this is a case where the concept of bless here implies curse, and so we have to make this sort of linguistic, semantic shift in our minds from barach, bless, to be translated as curse, or blaspheme, or disrespect, or however you want to go with it. Well, most scholars these days, I believe, would argue that this barach doesn't mean curse in some adapted way, but rather that a scribe has changed it, that originally it said curse God, and that a scribe has changed it to say bless God, because they just couldn't imagine, they just couldn't stand it to have the phrase curse God in the text and to read out loud curse God, even if it's quoted in a way that's not being approved of. They just couldn't have the words themselves. Brunn, overall, I think does a really excellent job of pointing out that the translations that say they are word for word or literal aren't actually that different in their approach and execution from those that say they are more dynamic, sense-based, phrase for phrase, however you want to describe it. And that's his point of his book, which is to tell those who are worried about this from a Christian point of view, don't worry about it. In the end, he has this really interesting list of the arguments that he makes. Every version does what? Every version is thought for thought and gives priority to meaning that deals with idioms and figures in ways that are dynamic, that allows the context to dictate many of its renderings, that steps away from the original form, that every version paraphrases to some degree, and every version sets aside the goal of reflecting each inspired word in order to better reflect the inspired naturalness and readability of the original. Now, this brings us to the question of inspiration. So, in chapter 6, he talks about his definition of inspiration, and the fact is that people do disagree on how to talk about inspiration. But he affirms, he says, this is my view of inspiration, that the Bible is inspired in a way that is verbal, plenary, infallible, and inerrant. Now, the words that are most important for us here are verbal and plenary, meaning that plenary is full, like all of it is inspired, not just part of it. So you can't say, well, here's this verse over here that is not inspired. And it is verbally inspired, meaning that God gave the words themselves to the authors. It's not that God inspired in the hearts or the ideas or the spirit of the author, and then the author chose their own words. The verbal inspiration is the idea that God gave the author these specific words. And the problem that Brunn is coming up against is, if you hold a view of verbal inspiration, how can you accept the idea that translation is dynamic? Because if the words themselves are inspired, then how can the translations also have inspired words when the words are necessarily different? I think it raises a deeper question than he gets to, which is, what does this idea of verbal inspiration have to do with translation as a linguistic or a philosophical process? How does the theology of the Bible create a certain tension or conflict with our linguistic and hermeneutical or philosophical understanding of how language works? So there are three affirmations that I want to highlight here. On page 114, he says, so while every word of Scripture has been breathed out by God, that does not mean they are all directly reflected in any of our English versions, which I think raises a question about how verbal inspiration even relates to Bible translation. Wayne Grudem has written an article in which he asked the question, are only some of the words inspired? I think it's a good question. Do some of them matter more than others? And I'm going to come down on the opposite side of this question than Grudem does. Might it be that verbal inspiration is not a helpful concept for discussing a Bible in translation at the very least, and I think also maybe even as a source text? It's worth pointing out, by the way, when he says that he believes that the Bible is God-breathed, or that God has breathed it out, the Scripture has been breathed out by God, that itself is an issue of translation. 2 Timothy 3:16 is the famous passage that generates this language, where the author says all Scripture is God-breathed, and most translations say inspired by God, but the NIV has persisted with God-breathed. That's a metaphor, right? So according to Brunn's own principles, shouldn't we adjust God-breathed to something more meaningful in our context? I guess my point is that God-breathed implies God speaking. God-breathed is verbal inspiration, according to this reading of this verse. But if in our translation we seek to capture the meaning rather than the explicit words, even of this idiom, maybe the concept of speaking in inspiration is not strictly required. This metaphor has been taken literally and has become a very important theological affirmation in ways that might be problematic. The second affirmation that we want to look at is this. He says on page 132, no, this is page 129. If the doctrine of verbal inspiration requires consistent word-for-word translation, then every English version is disqualified. Now, the terms that are used for literal translations or word-for-word translations, such as formal equivalence or transparent to the original or essentially literal, that these terms, he points out, however, all focus on the ideal rather than the real, meaning our ideal is transparency. Our ideal is equivalence. Our ideal is literal. But in reality, the ideal is impossible. And so he says he himself prefers the phrase modified literal. Literal is the ideal and modified is the real. It seems to me that the phrase modified literal, as I said earlier, creates a kind of hermeneutical problem, which is that it's a metaphor of something old that's being polished up and adapted, changed, bolted on, trimmed, fixed, and then put back into service in a new way. I think philosophically or hermeneutically it's more consistent either to say that the new thing is the old thing, as the literal word for word people would say, or the new thing is the new thing completely. The final quote that I want to mention is on page 132. It appears that the one thing that is truly consistent in Bible translation is the fact that it is impossible to be truly consistent. Now, here's my question that I'll end with. How can we interrogate the notion of consistency, which he does very well, and equivalence, which he also does very well, without also interrogating the notions of verbal inspiration and the notion of meaning? Once we have pointed out the slippery, dynamic, ever-changing nature of language, the contextual networks and fabrics of the way words have meaning, once you start that process, how can you stop without articulating its full implications, which is this: that texts have meaning as people read them in particular contexts, in particular communities, and that those readers bring meaning into that process and draw meaning from that process. And so therefore, the translation process is already the process of articulating new meanings, and the interpretation of a text is the process of creating new meanings. And that what we're doing when we read a translated text is we're reading, as Lefebvre has pointed out, a rewriting. So I end with a question for you. Do you think that consistency is possible in translation? Do you think equivalence is possible in translation? And if consistency and equivalence are not possible, then how can we talk about verbal inspiration with regard to an English text?